Hi, Susan. Hi, Emily and Susan. Good to
Hello,
see you.
Aya. Hello, everyone.
Yes, so we're at our time, and as usual, we're just going to wait another minute or two and allow folks to arrive and get settled in. Welcome, Charlesley. Good to see you. Hi, Virginia. Welcome, Andrew. Hi, Marianne. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome again. Always a treat to see you here and be practicing together. So, as usual for the Tuesday tune-in, we're going to just sit for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll transition into a Dhamma talk, give the talk again for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for question and answer at the end, or any kind of sharing you'd like to do. And this evening, I thought that we could do a little bit of mindfulness of breathing, and we'll just perhaps do those first 4 or 5 or 6 steps of the Anapanasati, 16 steps of mindfulness of breathing. So you can go ahead and begin to settle into your meditation posture. Sometimes it's helpful to rock the body from side to side or front to back, or move the head just to loosen up any tendency to lean toward the computer or carry tension in the hips. Sensing the weight of the body on the seat. And relaxing the belly. And from that stable base, then as best you can, allowing the spine to line up and come into an upright posture. Finding that alignment all the way up through the neck. Allowing the muscles of the chest, the upper torso to also just soften and widen. Allowing all thoughts to recede into the background as you place the mind on the sensation of the breath, wherever you feel it. just observing the breath and beginning to notice the inhalation, the pause, and the exhalation. Just staying curious about the breath, the mind, riding the length of the breath. The mind aware of the inhalation all the way along its length. And then the pause. And then riding the length of the exhalation. Now, having observed the length of the breath for some time, opening the attention to the whole body at once. And even as you observe the whole body, still aware of the breath, breathing the body. Aware of the whole body, and aware of the breath, breathing the body. Exhalation and inhalation. And perhaps aware of the whole body and the breath, breathing the body. You might notice that it settles even more. The body becoming very still. And all the while, inhalation and exhalation. Really attending to the breath so you know which is which. Staying curious about the breath and perhaps enjoying this time of just sitting quietly. Feeling the body breathe. enjoying the breath, breathing the body in this moment. Allowing everything else to just recede into the background. Beautiful. So now we're going to transition to the Dhamma talk. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Yesterday, I went to Facebook for a few moments, and I noticed a post by my friend Chris Burnham, a good Dhamma friend. And every year around this time, Chris posts a memory. You know how Facebook can do that. It can suggest something from years ago, from this time, this particular day, or this time of year that you posted, and suggest that you post that again as a memory. And so every year, Chris posts a memory, and it's a memory of his first tattoo. So this is the 8th year, according to his post yesterday, of his first tattoo. And it's a tattoo of some advice that I gave him when he was at when we were both at the monastery called Tassajara. a Zen training monastery in close to Carmel in California. And he asked what to do with anger and other corrosive emotions. What to do about anger and other corrosive emotions. And I replied, breathe through it. Just breathe through it. And so he had that tattooed on his arm years after we'd both left the monastery and gone on to different practice environments. And he had that tattooed on his arm. And so every year he posts this memory again. Breathe through it. And it's a beautiful reminder because, well, for many reasons. For one, because I feel like Chris and I are still practicing together all these years later, 10 years or so later. But also because for him, it was a very important question. I came to find out later when Chris started to speak publicly about having thoughts of suicide or some mental health challenges that were really troubling him. And so each year he comes back to this reminder. And so when I think about this statement, this question that he asked, how to practice with anger or other corrosive emotions. So I suppose one question is, what is it that's being corroded? Right? So just in case we have folks for whom this is a new word, so corrosion is like rust, is like a wearing away of usually a metal or some kind of wearing away of a hard substance. And I would suggest that particularly the way that Chris is using it, it's a wearing away of the quality of life, of your life, wearing away of your peace of mind, wearing away of your strength, your inner strength. And so the breath is a very important anchor for us as practitioners. It's a lifeline, really. And so that very simple answer hopefully serves him well, serves him in many different situations, in many ways. There are lots of ways to explore it and to think about it. We just did, for example, a practice of mindfulness of breathing. There's various types of meditations on the breath, formalized frameworks of how to meditate on the breath. And there is just the presence, the mindfulness, the being aware, turning our attention to that awareness of the breath. And so this way of thinking about also practicing with the breath or practicing with ill will or anger also reminded me of, not at the time when I was speaking to Chris, but later, of a teaching that the Buddha gave to about, well, it's a very long sutta. It's part of the long discourses, actually, number 2, in which the Buddha goes through various aspects of the teaching, and then he goes through the hindrances. And he relates the hindrances, he gives it a metaphor for each one of the 5 hindrances. So the hindrances are sort of unwholesome or unpleasant mental states that are sort of fogging up the natural clarity of the mind, making it difficult for us to see clearly how the mind is working and what's present there. And in particular about ill will and malevolence, as it was translated by Maurice Walsh, which is the hard copy version of the Digha Nikaya or Long Discourses, as often available. Ill will or malevolence is compared to a sickness, or to being ill in some way, having some kind of a disease. And then the Buddha said, when we recover from that, when we overcome that hindrance of ill will or anger, that it's like recovering from that disease. Literally, he says, it's like recovering your appetite, recovering your strength. So again, very direct metaphor of anger and ill will as something that is eroding our inner strength if we allow it to persist. But we can use the breath as a lifeline, again, as a place that we can return. And there are many good reasons why the breath is strongly emphasized in early Buddhist practice. One is just the sheer immediacy of the breath. Right? It is here in this moment that we find a breath. Maybe you've noticed that you can't hold on to a single breath. It comes and it goes, and then it comes and it goes. It has an immediacy to it that brings us here to the present moment. And it has an immediacy also in the sense that we can, but we absolutely don't need to, develop any great skill in order to come back to the breath as a place of awareness, as a place of anchoring ourselves in the moment, in the body, in the change that's happening from moment to moment. We can develop some skill, and there can be varying degrees of being able to observe the breath and use it as a meditation tool or as a tool for a basis, an object of our mindfulness. But it's not necessary. It can simply be just feeling your belly, right? Putting your hands there. There's a Sesame Street. I follow Sesame Street on Instagram. Sesame Street has, at least as far as I can tell, just in recent months, like maybe the last 6 months or so, started occasionally sharing something about how kids can put their hands on their belly and feel their breath when there's big emotions happening. Those are the words that they use. When there's big emotion or big feeling, then you can put your hands on your belly, feel your breath. And of course, another aspect of the breath, which is tremendously useful, is the embodied aspect of it. Right? So the breath has its own intelligence, its own knowing, its own rhythm of breathing the body. Sometimes it takes us a while to learn how to trust in that, right? And there can be the efforts at control or at tightening around the breath or some kind of feeling of anxiety around it. But eventually, if we let go of that, we will see that the breath will take care of what it needs to do. And And that can help us to stay in the body. And staying in the body is helpful because, as I've mentioned before, our cognitive experience is based on what we call contact, different kinds of interaction that the senses have with different kinds of objects. And the mind is considered to be one of the sense organs. So when the mind is relating to mental sense objects, so mind is relating to mind without checking in with the body, then that can very easily spin out. It can go to deep meditative states also. It can be a very skillful thing to do, actually, that the mind can become unified. There's a word for this in Pali, it's called ekagata. The mind can become unified and sort of step back from the coarser aspects of bodily experience. That's if it goes in the skillful direction, but it can also, you can imagine people like disassociation, for example. Dissociation is the mind relating to the mind and not being able to relate to physical world. That's one way that it manifests. Goodness knows I'm not a psychologist, so I wouldn't go any further than describing it than that. But we know that even just a simple thing like story upon story upon story, right? There's also a Pali word for that. It's called papancha, mental proliferation, right? We have reaction upon reaction, reaction to our reaction, then reaction to that reaction, and so on. And it just can spin out quite easily. So, and actually interesting, another idea that came to me when I was thinking about this talk today is that another benefit of the breath in terms of being embodied is that it's helpful even when the body is really suffering. So a good example of this is like women in labor, right? They're taught certain kinds of breathing techniques, certain ways of focusing on their breath. Right? Or when I was a chaplain in the hospital, oftentimes we would do breathing, meditation on the breath for folks who were in a lot of pain or folks who were having a lot of distress about being in the hospital in kind of crisis mode because of just the environment, very unfamiliar. So even when the rest of the body is suffering or going through some really, really dramatic pain or difficulty or energies, staying with the breath can still be helpful, can be a way of staying with the body. That's helpful even in the midst of all that. And in fact, there's a very famous sutta called the Giri Mananda Sutta, and it's about a monastic who is very ill, and the Buddha encourages him to use mindfulness of breathing. So the Venerable Ananda comes to the Buddha. This is in Guttara Nikaya 1060. Venerable Ananda comes to the Buddha and says, "Oh, it would be really nice if you would visit him because he's very, very ill and in a lot of pain." And the Buddha says, "Well, how about you go visit him, Venerable Ananda, and tell him the 10 perceptions, and then maybe he'll feel better." And the 10th of the 10 perceptions is the 16 steps of mindfulness of breathing. It's a practice of mindfulness of breathing. We just did the first 5 steps right here. And it continues on to awareness of mental activity and the mind itself, and then some contemplations around impermanence, dispassion, cessation, and letting go at the end. All the while aware of the inhalation and the exhalation, using that as a basis for keeping the mind settled and focused enough to look at other aspects of experience. So even for folks who are sick, it's said that Venerable Girimananda liked the talk from Venerable Ananda so much that he felt better. He got up after the talk. You felt better. So what about when the breathing is hard to watch? What about when we don't like what we see when we're breathing? So for example, some folks have health conditions where their breath can be very constrained or very painful, or sort of short of breath, a lot of shortness of breath. Or if we're having a lot of fear, for example, or some kind of strong emotions moving through, we might also see the breath reacting, right, by becoming very constrained or very short or labored. So what about that? What about if we see the breath and we don't like what we see there? So one way to think about that is that it's giving you some information, right? So the breath conditions the body, meaning that by resting the mind on the breath, as we did before, we can see that it aids the body to settle, right? But the breath also responds to the body, right? So we know that. For example, again, when you're in pain or if you're having some kind of emotion, and then the breath is showing you something about what's happening. So then we can take that as information. We can we can kind of take the scientific approach, so to speak, and relate to that as information. Ah, yes. So the breath is like this at this moment. The breath is being conditioned by what? And we can look at what are the conditions that are present that are causing that. And sort of really focus in on them as phenomena and as pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. Sort of begin to just unpack it a little bit. How is this? How is this? And by doing that degree of observation, then we learn something about why this is happening, what's going on for us. But we also train the mind to see that we can just be still with this. We can know that this is not a permanent condition either, that this situation will change, right? That we can observe it for some time and we can observe variation in it. And if it's showing us that there's fear, or if it's showing us that there is some underlying physical condition, then we can observe that and we can acknowledge that and start to find our peace with it, find our ability to just accept what's true about our lives and move to a response, a more skillful response, a response with more choice from that place. And then finally, what about if you can't really attend to the breath? What about if you're so swept away by what's going on that you can't even get the mind to rest on the breath, right? Frankly, I don't think it's that uncommon. I will tell you also a funny story about that. So when I first, way back when I first went to my first meditation instruction, this young woman was giving the instruction and she said, okay, now, so in between the breaths, there's a little bit of a pause and you just want to also notice that that's there. And I said, there is? Because I had never up until that point noticed that there was a little bit of a pause. This is already what, my early 20s. So sometimes we just can't. We're just not, we haven't trained the mind that way, or we're just swept away by what's going on, or sometimes it's just there's some kind of resistance happening in the mind. There are all kinds of reasons where we just simply cannot attend to the breath. So then what? Or anything in the body. Sometimes it's hard to attend to anything in the body. So in that case, again, we can take a sort of step back and take the bigger framework view and say, okay, let's observe the fact that I'm being pushed or pulled by these circumstances so strongly. Just acknowledge that. Just say, right, oof, swept away by, whatever thoughts are in the mind or whatever resistance is happening, emotional content, storyline, whatever it is, just observe the degree to which you are reacting to or being pulled or pushed or swept away by the feeling tones, the circumstances, the sort of pleasantness or unpleasantness of what's going on for you. And this can be, sometimes I would say, sometimes it's uncomfortable. It could be awkward. It could be, you could again be observing things you might not be happy to see. And other times it can be quite funny. It can be really, really funny. So I'll give you an example of that. So years ago, before the Tassajara times, there was some times in Japan. I was training at a Zen monastery called Hoshinji with Seke Harada Roshi. And Roshi was a very, very good teacher. Very good. He understood me well. He understood his students quite well. And, I think that he would try to point these things out, the way in which one might be caught by some idea. And so one day, it wasn't a teaching that was going on. I happened to be walking past Roshi's quarters there in the monastery, and his assistant was there also. This was not his usual assistant. This was another person. And anyway, Roshi and his assistant at the time, they were standing there, and she had a big box of these mochi sweets, these rice, very delicious Japanese rice sweets. And it's like a, box, like the assorted box of candies. It's kind of like that, but with different rice sweets in it. So anyway, so Roshi was standing there. Roshi didn't speak English at that time. He's passed now. He didn't speak English at all during his life. And but he turned to his assistant and he said something. And then she turned to me and he said, oh, he'd like you to have one. So please just, pick one of these sweets. You're welcome to have one. So, okay, great. So she holds up the box and I pick one of the sweets, whatever one looked delicious to me. And I bowed, said thank you, and I started to walk to my room, which is on the other side of the building, on the other side of the monastery from his quarters. And I get about halfway back to my room, and then his assistant, his attendant, comes calling. She comes running behind me and comes calling after me, and she's like, hey, Roshi said he wants that one back. He wanted that one. He wants that one back. And I had already eaten it. It was in my mouth. Holding my hands like this. I didn't even get back to my room before I had already popped the thing in my mouth. I didn't bother to sit down, which is the rule. I didn't do any of that. I just popped it in my mouth on the way there because it was going to be so yummy. And then Roshi wanted it back. And it's like, well, sorry, it's not coming back. And I thought about it. And at that moment, it was, of course, like a lot of chagrin. And she was like, what? His attendant was literally like, what? You did what? And I was like, yeah, it's all gone. So, and then I thought about it later and I thought, this is just Roshi like messing with me. This is Roshi actually teaching me a lesson. Because according to Japanese etiquette, you would never, ever, ever, ever ask for anything back that you gave to someone, no matter what it was. Even if it was his most favorite, his most treasured belonging, if you gave it away, then you never, ever, that's it. There is no such thing as asking for anything back. So, he was showing me something about how I was, really excited. I was really swept away by that excitement around the pleasant Vedana of that sweet, that little rice sweet. And it's not that there's, right, it wasn't like a big punishment or a big lecture going on or anything like that, right? It's not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just to observe the degree to which, right, it was like, dum, 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 just swept away by that, just carried by that. So it was really funny. And Roshi had his and I went back and we had a little, moment of smile recognition there also at some point. But I share that because again, we can have a look at what are the things that that we are responding to or reacting to, or and we can observe that phenomena, with some compassion toward ourselves, some goodwill toward ourselves. Okay, that's what's happening. If it is, and eventually with some practice, again, we can train the mind to observe that in more detail, understand the process that's behind it, understand, use the mind and body as real ways to steady ourselves, use the breath as a way of being willing to be here in the present moment and observing what's really going on in these bodies, in these minds. And when we do that, when we are willing to look at all of those states, the states of not being willing to practice and observe, the states of being willing to observe, and seeing our dukkha, our difficulties, and perhaps being able to observe with some equanimity and some deep compassion and wisdom about this process nature of life. Then all of those, by taking up all of those ways, by taking up the breath and the mind, we can see that each moment is an opportunity. That practice isn't just something that's going to happen on the cushion for us. Right? But that literally this whole life is a teaching. So thank you.